actually see the marching band arriving right here outside Buckingham Palace. We're at Canada Gate opposite the palace. You can possibly see, as well as a bank of members of the media, staff from the palace all actually came out at the end of the funeral service in Westminster Abbey. That was a very poignant moment. There are obviously members of the Royal Guards, but also lots of members of the police and the armed forces who are just here paying their respects with ordinary members of the public. We've been here for several hours, and it's been very interesting how quiet and somber it has been. There are a number of families with young children, but still that sense of occasion and silent respect has basically been here right the way through as people have followed what was happening in Westminster Abbey via large speakers. Of course, there is a lot of ceremony here already. There have been mounted guards going up the Mall as well. People are very aware that they are part of a huge machinery of this state funeral, if you like, and they're both following it on their mobile phones, but also eager to actually take in the sense of occasion themselves as well. And it's not just British people lining the streets here, but we've seen, for example, Canadian flags. And interestingly, it's members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who are actually at the front of the procession for the state gun carriage, as well as several members of the National Health Service. I've stepped out of the way of the camera now to let you get a view as the gun carriage is about to arrive here at Buckingham Palace. And then, as you can see, people filming on their mobile phones. It will gradually make its way from here up the road, Constitution Hill, to Wellington Arch, which, as James was just reminding viewers a while ago, was once upon a time actually an official entrance to Buckingham Palace. Wellington Arch by Hyde Park Corner there, and that's where the Queen's coffin will be transferred to the hearse, which will then take it on a 40-kilometre journey to Windsor. So what will happen is that there are further viewing areas for the general public along the route, going along the south of Hyde Park, one of the royal parks, and westwards through central London and onto not the motorway, which would be the normal route, but a road to allow the public to actually view the hearse proceeding to Windsor Castle and St George's Chapel for that service later on in the day.
The gun carriage and the procession now crossing Horse Guards Parade. It'll be a good 15 minutes, I should imagine, before it's near to where Nadine Barber was at Buckingham Palace.
That gun carriage, 123 years old, it actually weighs 2.5 tons, which is why it needs that 98 sailors to pull it. And you'll see there are sailors behind, another 40. They're acting as the brake if they need to stop. Gun carriage is, as I say, an antique. It's actually kept in temperature-controlled storage. And apparently, I'm told, they turn the wheels every day, every 7 days, throughout all the period it's been in storage, to prevent them getting egg-shaped, so they still continue to go around. Christopher Wilson with me still, the royal biographer and author, leaving Horse Guards Parade now, the gun carriage as you can see on these live pictures, and then will make its way up the Mall. These pictures being watched not just in the United Kingdom, but throughout the world. And that's the point, isn't it?
It is the point, and it is perhaps the most powerful moment of British monarchy. The whole thing about being a king or queen is to reach out to as many people as you possibly can, remind them of your influence and your benign presence. And no better way can you do that through the medium of television. And one estimate put the watching audience that I heard at something near 4 billion. Well, it's half the population of the globe. I can't think it can be that much, but it's something like that. One thing I just wanted to touch on, and that is, we've talked, haven't we, about this impeccable military precision with which everything has gone off. And in a sense, we expect this from the military. They practice, so especially for this end. But you can't absolutely guarantee that things are going to go right. We're seeing on top of the coffin the imperial state crown. This is a symbol of majesty, and it is really the most single important of the crown jewels. And during the state funeral of King George V, the Maltese cross, a priceless diadem, which contains a diamond once owned by Edward the Confessor in the 12th century, fell off. It fell off the crown and it just disappeared into the gutter. And it took a quick-witted sergeant major of the Grenadier Guards to scoop it up and put it in his pocket. And King Edward VIII, the short-lived king who abdicated, said, "This is a bad omen." And he was right.
So we watched the military, this long procession with a very long tail, and of course near the end is the coffin, which will slowly make its way up the Mall to Buckingham Palace, and that's not where it stops. It goes on to Hyde Park Corner and then on, using a different form of transport, using the hearse, all the way to Windsor. Let's talk for a moment about the military, because the Queen in her early years saw the military in their other role, in a wartime role, because she was a young girl during the Second World War. We're seeing these pictures now, but it must have been so different between 1939 and 1945. She stayed, or her parents decided to keep her and her sister Margaret inside Buckingham Palace during the war, during the bombing of Britain, the Blitz. They stayed inside, and during the final years of the war, she was old enough to actually serve.
She was. She and Princess Margaret Rose eventually moved to Windsor Castle, where, interestingly, it was revealed quite recently that the crown jewels, which we were just talking about, were buried in a biscuit tin under the walls of the castle, just in case the Germans invaded. And there they stayed for the duration of the war. Queen didn't know anything about this until it was revealed to her very recently.
Amazing story. And a memory of a very different time, a queen who spanned history, and it really does seem as a break in things now. I mean, I just think myself, my own family, the only members of my family, my grandparents who could remember World War II, passed away. My parents were children in World War II, and this really is the end of an era.
On that point, James, let's bring in once again Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mail, who's in our London studio. General, what do you make of what James and Christopher were discussing there about how Queen Elizabeth II really was representative of a generation?
Well, she actually was a representative of a generation, but I think what's remarkable is how the baton passes. That is the nature of monarchy. There's never not a monarch from the moment the previous monarch breathes his or her last. And of course what you're seeing is, in terms of what King Charles III will have for his coronation, the same uniforms on the Household Cavalry, the same uniforms on the Guards battalions, the same gentlemen ushers, the Knights Pursuivant, whose tabards will go all the way back to, I think it's Edward III. So there is this extraordinary, in among this magnificence, and I like to think every one of your viewers is absolutely marvelling at the choreography of this. Worth saying, although we talk about rehearsing it, the reality is it's only been put together in the last few days, because you bring in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, you bring in the contingents from across the Commonwealth, you bring in the members of frontline workers in the National Health Service, you put together the gun carriage and the people flying back from across the world. So even more astounding that this spectacle has been put on. But as I say, I think what you've got is this amazing slight cliche of change and continuity at the same time. And that's very reassuring, I think. And I really hope that the younger generation who are watching this, who may well see certainly a coronation, maybe another royal funeral in their time, will think back to this, and it will make them again invest and think about the importance that constitutional monarchy has for the political stability of this country and its contribution around the world. So I think it's a magnificent, utterly magnificent spectacle. But at the heart of it is some very, very important constitutional, historical lessons. And it's wonderful to see it so well reported.
Many, of course, of her subjects will have known no other monarch. She has been there throughout their lives. She has been the one point of stability when so much has changed in their lives. And as I said, coming back to this question I put to you about that generation that she represented, it was a generation for whom duty and sacrifice were far more important than it seems to the current generation. Am I right there, or is that just a feeling?
No, I think you're absolutely right. It was a much more homogenous society, inevitably. It had gone through the horrors of the First World War. Remembering Britain alone lost 800,000 young men. Within 20 years into another war, victorious, but at the time of the coronation, and I was born 3 years after the coronation, London was still in many cases a bomb site. So all the memories of that war, and I think were still all around the people. London smogs, etc. A lot of the servicemen on parade at that time would, of course, have fought in the war, or absolutely have very, very close memories. Many were about to go to Korea or had come back. And so there was a feeling of salvation there. So I think it is just important to remind ourselves that this monarchical succession is 1,000 years old. And there is stability and reassurance in understanding that the baton has now passed from Her Majesty to King Charles III, as it did from the King George VI. And that's important.
General, of course, many more of that generation, many people of that generation, like the Queen herself, will have served because national service was still in place. So it was a requirement for all young people to have contact with the military, and there was that ethos of duty and sacrifice, which no longer exists. I'm going to have to cut you fairly short here, General, but I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, absolutely. And at a time when everybody had a relation, or they themselves had been in the military. So the issue of God, Queen and Country, or God, King and Empire, as it was when my father signed up as an Air Force officer, was very much at the forefront. But I think service is universal, and I'm all for more and more people serving in the armed forces for all sorts of reasons. But one of them is it gives us a very close connection to the constitutional structure of this country.
Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mayle, many thanks indeed. The gun carriage carrying the Queen's coffin now coming up the Mall towards Buckingham Palace. Al Jazeera's Nadeem Barber is at Canada Gate. They're just outside Buckingham Palace. Nadeem?
Well, the crowd who've been here for hours now, fully aware because they can see the band passing already, the marching band, and they're aware that the carriage is actually on the Mall. There are large numbers of just the general public, but also members of the military, members of the police, and so on. Medical volunteers have all lined the streets here and have been paying their respect in silence during the funeral service, and are now just, they know, minutes away from actually viewing the gun carriage as it makes its way past Buckingham Palace, where staff have actually come out to pay their respects as well. Let me just stand out, get out of the way so that you can actually get a better view, and just talk a bit about what the atmosphere has been like so far. There are a hugely diverse type of people here lining the Mall and the streets around the area. There are a noticeable number of families with young children. I saw a little girl sitting on her father's shoulders earlier on, either taking photos or video to capture all of the day's events. And lots of people will want to introduce their children to the whole ceremony and the sense of history of this day by actually coming here in person, but also people are able to view the day's proceedings in special areas like in Hyde Park, just up the road from here, where there's a giant screen. Similarly, in Edinburgh at Holyrood Park, and in northern cities like Hull and Manchester and Leeds, the same being offered to the general public. But back to the capital here. The procession is actually being led by members of the Royal Mounted Canadian Police, the Mounties, as well as representatives of Britain's National Health Service, including the woman who administered the first COVID-19 vaccine, interestingly enough. And there are a number of Canadian visitors here. I've seen Canadian flags along the route. Of course, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, making reference to the Queen's commitment to serving not just this nation, but the Commonwealth as well. And so a very international crowd, if you like, down here near Buckingham Palace, to making sure they're here for this historic day. It's been very sombre, very reflective, very quiet, interestingly enough, just waiting to get a glimpse of the gun carriage before it goes up the road, up Constitution Hill to Wellington Arch, where, as we were saying, it will actually be transferred onto the hearse for that journey to Windsor. And all the while, you might be able to hear, in fact, there have been guns. We can hear the big guns being fired just up the road in Hyde Park since the end of the funeral service itself.
Al Jazeera's Nadine Barber there, live outside Buckingham Palace, as the gun carriage now makes its way down the Mall towards Canada Gate and Buckingham Palace.
This is a very long procession, a very slow procession that we're seeing here. And that's the way these things are done. And that's also so that everyone lining the Mall and then beyond the Mall, as you see that shot, gets to see and say a final farewell to the Queen of 70 years. Still you're hearing the tolling of the bells every minute or so. Ed Owens, Royal Historian, is joining me now. This will be the final time that the Queen sees, well, she will not see it, of course, she's in a coffin, but her body will pass Buckingham Palace, a place where she lived for all the time she was monarch. It's not, I'm told, Ed, somewhere that they particularly like living.
I think Buckingham Palace is currently undergoing some renovation, mainly because much of its plumbing system is outdated and its electrical system. So much of that's being stripped away and redone at the moment. I know that Elizabeth II's favourite royal residence, well, she had two of them. That was Balmoral and Windsor Castle. And when she had the choice, she would prefer to spend time really in quiet retirement in more recent years at Windsor Castle. What I'm struck seeing here is, again, just to reiterate the point, that this is a magnificent military procession. I think in terms of its historical nature, we can sort of think back 130 years when the Mall was deliberately widened specifically to create space for grand military processions of this kind. Much of central London was reorganised to give the British nation essentially an imperial marching route. The first big royal funeral of the 20th century, that of Queen Victoria, her son Edward VII played a key role in choreographing the military aspects of the event, and he was taking his cues, taking inspiration from recent royal funerals that he'd seen take place in Europe, actually, in Germany and Imperial Russia, where there was this strong military element, because of course these were not just great imperial powers, the European nations of the late 19th century, they were also the great military powers. They were the great geopolitical players of the period. So what we are witnessing in front of our television screens is really the echoes down more than a century of that tradition, of a Victorian tradition, which sought to celebrate the military's strong connection to monarchy and the strength, and I suppose the symbolism of strength that it represents.
As you say, scenes from another era in many ways, but maybe that's why they are so poignant, and particularly poignant on this day after the service that we've seen in Westminster Abbey. Worth reminding you what is to happen in the coming hours, because you will see this procession continuing past Buckingham Palace and then heading to the Wellington Gate, which is just past Buckingham Palace. Originally was one of the gates to the palace, a ceremonial arch, and there the gun carriage pulled by the Royal Navy, 98 members of the Royal Navy, will stop there, and the bearer party will take the coffin from the gun carriage and place it on the royal hearse. But then the procession continues by car. People from London will be able to see the Queen and say goodbye to the Queen for the last time as she then travels through West London, and will the cortege will make its way then all the way to Windsor Castle, right now continuing its journey down the Mall. And before it gets to Buckingham Palace, Ed, it will be passing Clarence House. That is currently home to King Charles. It's not entirely clear, is it, whether he is going to move to Buckingham Palace like his mother. And it's perhaps worth reminding viewers that in 1952, Queen Elizabeth and her husband, Prince Philip, initially weren't so keen. They would quite like to have stayed in Clarence House.
The only problem with Clarence House is that it's some way off the Mall and hidden from public view. What we know so far is that certainly it won't be until the renovations of Buckingham Palace are complete that our new King and Queen Consort consider the possibility of moving home there permanently. What we do know is that Buckingham Palace will remain the main ceremonial residence of the British monarchy. With a coronation planned for next year, we can anticipate the familiar balcony appearances. It's worth just remembering that the west face of Buckingham Palace was deliberately refronted in the early 1910s so that it was directly facing the Mall, so that people could gather outside the Buckingham Palace gates and greet their royal rulers by way of gesturing at the balcony. So I think we will likely see that Buckingham Palace remains in service, but it could be some time before our new monarch takes up residence full-time there.
Dr. Ed Owens there. It is a little after 1200 hours GMT, 1 o'clock in London. You're watching Al Jazeera's special coverage of the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. Our diplomatic editor James Bays in London. I'm Adrian Finnegan, and Nick Clark is at Westminster Abbey, where, of course, a little over an hour ago, the funeral service itself for Queen Elizabeth came to a close. Nick, what did you make of it all?
Well, before I come to that, just to show you the scene, see over my shoulder here, the last remnants of the guests, just still gathered on the forecourt of the Great West Door, just probably waiting for their bus to leave. Most of them have gone already, just probably recounting to one another how moving that whole service was. The Queen came back to Westminster Abbey, the place where she was crowned, the place where she married the love of her life, her stay, as she put it, Prince Philip. And she laid a great faith, and the psalms and the hymns and the prayers soared to the rafters. It was incredibly moving. I don't think anybody could fail to be touched by it. And perhaps even more so was when, for me, when I was watching from here, we had a very good view looking down towards Parliament Square of the procession with the coffin on the state carriage. And there was draped in the royal standard with the imperial crown and the organ scepter. And behind the Queen's children, the King, his sister, and two brothers, just marching in, their children following too. And there was a moment up here, it's on a big platform, there's a whole load of press all the way along here. There was a moment as the carriage approached, very quiet anyway, but the whole press gallery here suddenly went silent, and everybody looked and stood in total respect. It was quite an incredible thing. And these, hard-nosed journalists, but couldn't fail to be moved by what was an impressive moment, a sense of respect almost overwhelming. You could hear a pin drop. And then I thought another really key moment was when, just at the West Gate there, as the gun carriage was leaving and the Queen's coffin had been put back on the gun carriage to go on this procession that we've been seeing. And there was a view of her children, Charles and Andrew and Edward and Anne. And then just a little bit further back, set back, was Princess of Wales with Charlotte and George. The third in line to the throne. And it was just an iconic moment. It was very, very powerful. And so now, of course, the Queen's coffin in procession to Wellington Arch. Wellington Arch used to stand at